Hello, my name is Patrick Lennon, and this is my podcast, How the News Has Shaped My Views on Race. This idea for a podcast came to me after we watched the video about Alexandra Bell's work with editing newspaper articles and showing how racism is still incredibly prevalent in modern journalism. Now, when I say that my views on race have been shaped by the news, that is not to say that I blindly believed anything that was written in a newspaper or said by a news anchor on TV. I was fully aware that most news outlets are somewhat impartial in all news stories. I just assumed that more established news outlets like the New York Times and CNN and the Washington Post, or in fact any news outlet that isn't ultra-conservative like Fox News or one of those crackpots on the internet, has the best interests of their reader or viewer in mind and just tries to tell the truth. I realize now that even those that appear to be balanced can in fact be incredibly harmful and filled with disinformation. The Center for American Progress reports that news outlets in New York City in 2014, when reporting on crime, showed a mugshot or image of a suspect in police custody more often when a suspect was black than if they were white. This was the kind of racism I saw in news. That's what I expected. Before this race unit, I didn't understand that the very way an article is structured can be supportive of systemic racism. Now, I've already mentioned that it was the video about the work of Alexandra Bell that we watched in class that made me choose this topic for my podcast. Of all Miss Alexandra Bell's work, however, the piece I found most thought-provoking was that of her edits on the New York Times article, 2 Lives at a Crossroads in Ferguson.
The title is 2 Lives at the Crossroads, equating these 2 lives as if they're neighbors. The Times layout to me perpetuated that. The subtlety there is that this isn't equal. These people aren't equal footing. They have equal responsibility in this event that took place, and that's not true. I don't believe that. You have a cop and you have a kid, and there's a responsibility here, and it lies with one person more than the other. I know he was 18. I feel like if he wasn't black, we would be calling him a kid. But there's a lot of what in journalism is key information. He'd sometimes use drugs and he'd rapped, and I just don't think that that's necessary information.
The layout that Alexandra Bell took issue with was as follows. 2 pictures, side by side, of police officer Darren Wilson and Michael Brown, with the titles A Low-Profile Officer with Unsettled Early Days and A Teenager Grappling with Problems and Promise, respectively. In her work, Miss Bell got rid of Officer Wilson's picture completely, along with most of the original article, so her piece would tell the story not of a cop and the man he shot, but rather a kid with his whole life in front of him who was cut down senselessly in the street. To me, Alexandra Bell had the right idea. News outlets ought to focus on things that are actually newsworthy. In some issues, both sides do not in fact deserve equal footing or representation. Sometimes one party is simply wrong. A murderer and his victim should not be treated equally in the news. Now, you might be thinking, gee, Patrick, you handsome devil, that's just one story from a newspaper. Who even reads those things anymore? Well, if newspapers aren't your speed, let's look at how the way the news treats social media also supports systemic and ingrained racism. All the liberal news channels that respond with outrage to Donald Trump's offensive tweets are guilty of the racial detour, white on white, and righteously so. They are giving these hateful messages a much larger audience by talking about how awful they are on national television. If Trump's tweets were confined to Twitter, it would not be such a big problem, but instead, each one is treated as news of the greatest importance. The actions of these liberal news channels Allow Trump's words to reach more of his supporters who agree with his message. When white people who oppose Donald Trump hear these, they often think, I would never say anything like that. I'm on the same side as the minority. Those people will stay up on their high horse and ignore how their own lives have been improved by systemic racism. Some journalists are themselves already aware of the problem of looking to Twitter for stories to report, though perhaps they are not aware of the social and racial consequences these actions have. The Columbia Journalism Review states that journalists often say they spend too much time on Twitter and wind up devoting more time than they should to stories that come to them via tweets. Now, dear listener, before we end, I know you're probably thinking, I'm back here being all high and mighty, talking about how journalists should and shouldn't go about reporting the news in regards to race. After all, I am just a teenager, and a white one at that. Up until recently, I wouldn't have even thought about a newspaper layout, and I would have been all for hearing about Trump's awful tweets. Thanks to this race unit in eggs, and all I learned while doing this podcast, I now recognize that the news I receive holds racist undertones in the very way it is presented to me, be it in print or on a screen.